how to teach thinking methods, or if you want to look at it, how to teach rationality, how to teach the student the proper use of his mind. And I'm here focusing almost entirely on what you do in the primary and secondary years. By the time you reach college, for good or evil, your thinking methods are pretty well determined, and it's a tremendous struggle to improve or alter them. But this is what to do with a young child to reach the proper stage by the time he gets to college. Now, we can say at the outset that you do not teach the method of thinking by giving a course once and for all in grade 2 or even grade 9 on the proper method of thought, however simplified and however well presented. You cannot sit down with these youngsters and tell them, this is the rules of deduction, these are the key fallacies to avoid, this is how to engage in induction and definition and so on. That is much too abstract for their intellectual level. They simply do not have enough data yet, enough knowledge of the subject matter. And therefore, however well you present the rules, they will necessarily be theoretical, floating, essentially unreal to them at this age. Extrospection must precede introspection, whether in an individual or in the whole history of the human race. First, we have to look out, gather information, facts, content. Then, at a certain level of sophisticated development, you can look in and analyze what is your consciousness doing with this content. You can abstract the method you're using and, if necessary, improve. So I would say the earliest stage, in my opinion, to give a formal course in method is the late high school years, the mid-teens. And at that point, it would merge into a course on epistemology. I do not rule out giving some tips, some logical fallacies to watch for, and so on in the earlier years, but I do not regard that as the primary method. That would simply be rationalism, to manipulate abstractions of methodology to a young class and expect it to have any content. Now, the modern progressive alternative to this rationalist idea that you sit down and lecture on methodology, the modern progressive alternative of teaching method is just turn the kid loose and let him explore or experiment on his own and find out what, quote, works in solving his problems. That is complete abdication, because you're expecting the child to discover on his own the methodological discoveries of the whole human race to date. We've said already education must be directive. You cannot just sit back and wait for nature or the child to do something. So what is the proper solution or the right method of teaching method? I would say it must be directive, but not by means of floating abstractions. It must be by a procession of specifically chosen concretes. Specifically chosen concretes. You must teach the child method on concrete subject matter. You have to address specific subject matters rationally time after time, and I mean here literally hundreds of times across many years. Instance after instance of what rational thinking consists of, so that he is steeped in the proper thinking methods in actual daily examples. With each new point or each new subject, the child must be getting another example of this is how to think, this is what is involved, this is what the mind should be doing. Not as an abstract preachment. It's not necessary for the teacher, after each correct example, to stand back and say, you see what I'm doing A, B. He doesn't have to do that. Just give the examples on a variety of subject matter, time after time, and properly done, the child at a certain point will be ripe when he reaches an older age to simply abstract what the common denominators are. Teaching is a form of communicating thinking. After you have many examples of good teaching, that is, good communication of thinking, it is very easy to abstract the common denominators, at which point the student can become an independent thinker. I do not believe he can become an independent thinker earlier. Now, in a sense, when he's 6 or 8 or 12, he can think on his own in a receptive sense. He can judge about somebody's presentation or statement. Is this clear? Does it make sense? And so on. But he cannot delve into new material and direct his mental processes and discover the new in a rational, self-sufficient way, he can't be creatively in control until he reaches beyond this stage that we're talking about. So to summarize this point, to teach well is to teach according to certain conceptual principles. And this very act teaches the information about method that will later be abstracted into formal thinking methods. Now, the method of organizing or presenting these methods to you today, there's a lot of options. I have decided to organize the presentation around three broad principles of good teaching, or three broad principles of teaching method. And I'll say something about each. Each could be the subject of an extensive lecture, but let's say something about each. And as I say, I don't insist that this is the only possible presentation, but I think it captures some important highlights. Number one, motivation. Motivation. Man has free will. He has a volitional consciousness which begins on the conceptual level. Conceptualizing is a voluntary activity. It requires a commitment of effort, time, work, focus, sweat, mental sweat. It can be difficult. And you must have a reason to do it. A purpose, a reward, a result that you want to achieve. There are countless possibilities of what to do with your mind, or what the student can do with his mind, what to learn, how to employ his mental time. Out of all those possibilities, he has got to know why this one, what for. That is the number one first question that must be answered convincingly, or everything else is a waste of time. There is no use giving the most wonderful presentation without the motivation. It simply doesn't take. Motivation is a presupposition of the student having an active mind. He will have an eager interest in his subject, a curiosity, a desire to know, only because he sees a value in doing so. Now, he may stay with the subject for a few minutes on the grounds of generalized goodwill toward cognition. But he will not persist without motivation. Every subject, however wonderfully presented, has dry stretches, complicated parts, the difficulties. Counter to the progressive propaganda, not all learning is orgasmic. Sometimes you have that phenomenon, and that's a wonderful reward, but there's a lot of build-up and foreplay. If you just shove the material at the student as a duty and say, learn this, without convincing him as to why, he'll just wander off at the first obscurity or dry spot. An active mind has to be a motivative mind. Motivation is also a precondition of a reality-oriented approach to any subject. You cannot be reality-oriented if you're not motivated. Knowledge is not an end in itself. It is a means to deal with reality. In other words, with actual concretes in the student's life. And that really is what motivation consists of. It consists, in essence, of pointing to the concretes in reality that the child will be dealing with, and showing him how he can deal with them better if he learns what you are teaching. That's the only way you can anchor a whole subject from the outset in facts. You make every subject part of the skill of dealing with reality, as against, I just learned this stuff because somebody told me to. If you learn in that latter way, that's a guarantee of having the subject float in your mind, however well it is taught, and however many eloquent examples the teacher gives you. Because the whole subject, if unmotivated, is disconnected from reality. In other words, from your life in reality, so it may as well just be a series of Platonic abstractions. Now, if I were teaching the philosophy of education, to take this example, and I came in, the typical unmotivated way to do it would just be to say, our subject is the philosophy of education, take down this definition. That's if I even, deigned to give you a definition, but suppose I did. Education is systematic instruction, and so, and you take it down, and then I say, now let's go over. If you do it that way, the whole thing, and that's, as you know, is the better college classes, or better grade school classes start with the definition. The worst ones don't even do that much. The whole thing would then stand in your mind as, well, what does this have to do with anything? Why do I have to know what it is? What would I do with it? And the result is, it is floating, not connected to any concretes in your life, and ultimately you simply wouldn't retain it. Whereas as I did it, granted I did it much too briefly, but nevertheless, I tried to indicate, you deal with children, you have to decide what to do. I tried to demarcate an area of actual concretes in your lives that directs you at once to a realm of life and reality. Another thing motivating accomplishes is the first step in teaching proper values. We'll see later that just as with methods, so with values. You don't teach them by abstract lecturing, but by proper concretes. And the first step in teaching the proper values is by the kinds of motivation you endorse and rely on. To motivate a class is to specify specific values that you're going to accomplish. Now, students are generally confused about motivation, about value questions. They're young. You actually encourage certain values in them by the kinds of motivation you offer. For example, in the motivation that I gave you for this course, I was relying on the fact and trying to instill the idea you should be responsible as parents. You can't depend on the teacher. You have to be independent. Those were the kind of values I was appealing to in stressing why you should know the material. A proper motivation teaches rational values. In some form or another, it communicates to the child you're going to develop your powers, your ability, your capacity to stand on your own, to judge independently, and so on. As against, learn this because society demands it, or because you will thereby fit in better with the group, or because everybody's doing it, or because I say so, etc. Now, it is of course important that you appeal to a child's actual values, and not simply rational values that he doesn't care about, because he will not react to a motivation that doesn't address values that he actually cares about. But my point here is you have to select out of whatever mixture he brings you those values which are rational. If he has mistaken or neurotic values, those are not the ones that to pander to. If he happens to have a craving for power over others, or neurotic popularity, don't tell him, learn this arithmetic lesson because all the girls will love you. Well, but all the people will love you is an undesirable motivation if that's your primary motivation. You pick out what you know you can count on in him, however fragmentary, and try and strengthen and appeal to that. So I summarize that motivation is urgent. It's the precondition of an active mind, the first step in tying the child's conceptual faculty to reality, and in helping provide him with rational values. Now let's pause here for a moment to contrast on this one point the two other schools of education, the intrinsic and the subjective. What is an intrinsicist attitude toward motivation? You don't need it. Absolutely not. Why not? Because motivation is a process of getting consciousness ready to learn, preparing the inner conditions. And for an intrinsicist, consciousness is completely passive. It's a mirror. It doesn't do anything. It just sits there while reality writes on it. So it's completely unnecessary to do anything to get the consciousness ready. So the teacher simply comes in and starts to dictate, and the students just swallow it down. That's the Prussian model. Now, of course, progressive, the subjectivist side, is very big on motivation. They'll spend the whole class on motivation, and then they get one data in at the end, which they say is tentatively possible. However, what is their idea of motivation? Subjective. Anything that interests the student, whatever. The whole idea of progressive motivation is find something his emotions respond to. It couldn't make any difference less, and then connect the lesson to that. Now that perverts the whole purpose of motivation. It makes motivation a means to whim worship instead of a means to developing rationality and connection to reality. Motivation should not be an appeal to any arbitrary value, not even if it would work temporarily in really motivating the child. Motivation is part of long-range conditioning. Now, as to how to motivate, there are many different ways to do it according to the subject and the audience. Some things, to some audiences, are pretty obviously important. So only a very brief motivation is required. Now, for instance, this course, judging this audience, and the total time we have, I did not think it was important to go into a big song and dance, because you're spending a lot of money. That suggests already a significant level of motivation. You're spending a lot of time and not getting any outside credits. You've already read reams of material on the importance of philosophy, etc. So, from the fact that you came all over for these lectures, I figure an indication is enough you're already avid, you see. But suppose it was a freshman on this campus from the University of California, and they had the standard non-knowledge of philosophy, contempt for ideas, etc. You couldn't possibly come in the way I did and say, well, you want to know philosophy of education because such and such. It would just wash right over them. It wouldn't alter one drop of their mental functioning. You would have to start from the beginning of what is philosophy and why is it necessary, and ideas are not a waste of time, and you would have your work cut out to motivate them in 4 lectures before you even started on philosophy of education. So you have to define your audience carefully. Are you lecturing to a child or an adult or teaching? Is it an individual? Is it a group? Do they already have an established knowledge and interest in an area or not? Now, if you're an objectivist teacher and I'm lecturing on the philosophy of education, it's a snap to motivate you relative to, for instance, motivating a child to read Shakespeare. Then you have your work cut out. Let's take then the hardest case with regard to motivation for a moment. A young student to whom you're teaching a new and complex conceptual subject. His parents have sent him to you. He has no specialized interest yet, which is no fault of his. He has no career interest yet, so you can't attach this subject to his lifelong career passion because he hasn't formed it yet. Yet you have to motivate him. And you see there's a problem here. You have to teach youngsters subjects that will develop and train their conceptual faculty so that then they will be able to choose adult values and you can motivate them easily to learn further. But here in the grade schools, you have to motivate them in acquiring a skill that is not yet real to them for purposes that are generally vague and way off in the future as they see it. So there is a real difficulty. You will be a failure if you say to your child or your student, in effect, Johnny, for the next 10 years, you're going to learn how to think. Someday you'll need this. I mean, that's what it comes down to. That really is the message, but you have to do it a little better than that, or it won't take. So the question is how to do it. Of course, every subject has its own distinctive handle. But just to say a few things about this, the clue to solving this problem is that, although in one sense it's much harder to motivate the young, in another sense it's much easier to motivate the young than a formed adult. Precisely because a youngster is still unformed. He's still open and intellectually flexible. Let me give you an example here. Suppose someone tried to motivate me to learn economics. I mean, not just read a book, but really motivate me to devote the time and the effort, learn in detail, take a series of courses and so on. It would be impossible. I could tell you that now because, not that I derogate economics, but because I'm so specialized in my interests. I'm so definite in what I do and don't want to know. I'm so integrated around one area that it would simply be impossible to blast me into the effort necessary. However eloquent and however much abstractly I granted, it would be nice to know more economics, but it's also nice to know 50 other things, you see. But as a college student, I was more open about economics. I felt, well, I want to know something about production and trade. I was not yet so one-track oriented. Now, children illustrate the same idea. They are not so committed and oriented and all developed around one area. They're generally open to new knowledge. They know the big thing that you have going for you in motivating children is that they know they do not know what's going on. They know they're way behind these big people, the adults, whom they're very eager to emulate. They know they've got oceans to learn. So they are ripe to teach and relatively easy to motivate if only you present the value of the subject to them in some terms they can grasp. And here I would say the principle of motivation is this. Show them that the skills they themselves want or might want someday to have depend on knowing this subject. Show them that the skills they themselves want to have or might want to have depend on mastering this subject. Now, the might want is very different. It's very important to add in because there's a lot of things they don't necessarily want, but they know that they don't know what they're going to do with their lives, and they might want this someday. And that's what is your biggest hope in motivating. Now, I'll give you one simple example. I stress this is a very simplified example, but just so as not to be completely floating here. Suppose you're teaching literature. Here is one way, not the only way or the whole way, but one way to motivate. A natural way would be, to youngsters, 8, 10, whatever. A natural way would be through characterization. I would tell a class inappropriately simple language, and you'd have to slow down the presentation. You wouldn't pour it at them at this rate. I'd tell them, you deal with people all the time. Sometimes they disappoint you. You know you have to learn to figure them out, to judge which ones are good, which are bad. Can you get any clues from some traits that will let you predict others, what leads to what, etc.? Or I would say, you're growing up. There's all kinds of different people around you. You're going to decide what kind you're going to be. Wouldn't you like, an indication of the possibilities, like a menu at a restaurant? These are all the meals you can choose from. Well, you want a menu of all the different types of human being, and then you pick out the one that you want to be. Well, that's really, I would say, what literature is. It's like a menu of the kinds of human beings, what to expect, and it's a constant exercise. And if you see this trait, is this one going to follow? Who does this remind you of, etc., and so on. If you work all that out and you don't put it to him that fast, he starts to read right away with a kind of interest in. This will help him judge people. This will help him figure out his playmates. This will help him decide what he wants to be. And it makes it much more interesting than if you just have to read because you have to read. Now, when you motivate, I want to stress, motivation is not simply something you provide the opening class or the opening discussion. It must be continuous. You have to persistently refer back to your motivation throughout the entire subject matter. You have to show that you are actually delivering on your promise and achieving the value in question. So if you're teaching literature, you have to repeatedly ask, do you want to be like this guy? Why or why not? What did you learn? What do you know about people that you didn't know before, etc.? It's a continuing responsibility that you cannot drop. Now, this is the main thing about motivation, but there are some extrinsic or lesser factors, not primaries, but secondary ones, that are helpful in motivating, which I want to briefly touch on. The essential motivating factor, as I said, is communicate how the developing mind will be helped in knowing this material. But there are adjuncts, assuming you do that. One is the teacher's enthusiasm is crucial. His vitality, his excitement, his energy, his commitment to the subject. This has often been noticed on manuals on teaching. And the actual reason for it is necessary if the class is to get a consistent picture. If the teacher says to them how important the subject is, he is eloquent on explaining its importance, but he drones on as though it bores him out of his mind, that is a naked contradiction presented to the young child. Because the question is, if it's so important, why is he so bored? as against if he communicates, this is urgent, this is crucial, I love it, it's really exciting. That makes a tremendous difference from kindergarten right through graduate school. And it's really very important to providing proper motivation. So I would tell you this piece of practical advice. If you do not like a subject, either don't teach it or cover it up. In other words, and that's not immoral by any means. Act. Regard your teaching as active. But whip up a storm of excitement. It's possible to be infectious while innerly thinking, well, it's 2:03, I only have 57 minutes, but you keep yourself going. Now, every professional teacher must do this to some extent, however they love the subject. When they get to ASA the 998th time, it's not quite as thrilling, you know. You simply have to learn the technique of making it as though you are coming at this for the first time and you just relish it. Now, as I say, that's just a secondary factor. If you do the most excited manner, but they have no idea why, they're just baffled. So you have to first lay down the actual reasons for the subject. Another secondary factor, which I strongly advocate as a secondary factor, is anything reasonable at least, that will make learning a pleasurable experience. Now, in a general, long-run way, enjoyment does accompany the gaining of valuable information. But the trouble is, the pleasure is often delayed, interrupted, or whichever, by necessary and unavoidable arid stretches in the subject. And my view is that anything goes that will get you through those drier stretches, so long as you don't displace or subvert the essential presentation. That's why, for instance, I'm a strong advocate of humor as part of any presentation. Humor is a terrific thing if you can do it. I mean, it's not good to keep saying, this reminds me of a story, you know, because the class sits back, starts to sigh. But anything you can do to make them laugh or titter or anything, give them the idea this is not such an awful process. It helps to keep them awake. Now, you should not be a perpetual comedian, but as an adjunct, it's very valuable. As part of this promotion of pleasure, I'm an advocate of making games out of learning as much as you can. Again, without subverting the purpose. I bless the man who taught me Latin in grade school because we played it always as a baseball game. There were teams, and if you got all four parts of the verb, that was a home run. And it was constantly to see which team would come out first. We had spelling bees in English. We had debates. It was constant games of one kind or another. Now, as a primary, I don't advocate that. But within the context of the proper motivation and presentation, I think it's a valuable adjunct. A child wants to exercise his powers and get an immediate reward. Not just that someday he is going to be smarter and able to function. So I have to tell you, in defiance of some of the outraged letters that I get in the mail, that I am an advocate of what is called, quote, competition and, quote, prizes in school. Now, there are people who think that this is vulgar and depraved, that a child should be motivated only by the desire to know reality, that it introduces psychological corruption if he competes with others, or is given a prize saying he's first or second or whichever. I do not accept that theory. Of course, I don't think they should be primaries. I don't think the basic motive that you instill in him should be to beat others or win accolades. But within the proper framework, as a secondary theme, I do not think it's harmful, and I think it adds a definite element of motivation and pleasure. I was brought up that way. It was definitely contributed from the earliest grades to making school fun. We were showing off, but in a perfectly good sense, in the exact way that if we have or you have this baseball game next week, you're going to want to beat the faculty and vice versa, and that does not make you psychologically aberrated. And it is much more fun that way than if you're doing it just because you want to, I don't know for what other reason you would do it. Competition is not a dirty word, regardless of some of the things that some advocates of Montessori interpret it to be. I think you could even make the point that competition is an essential of capitalism, and it's, or at least an important aspect, and it's really a form of self-assertiveness. You can't overdo it. You know about the Frenchman who came to an English college and asked in a perfectly casual way how many students committed suicide after each set of exams. And was amazed to find that they don't regularly commit suicide, whereas in France, in his area, there's droves of them, which they take for granted. Now, I think that's overdone. All right, I'm going to hasten on to the second point of the three that I would like to get to, and that is integration. This is not racial, but cognitive integration. This is assuming now you've motivated the class. In general, integration is the process of connecting or relating data. It means presenting information to the child not as discrete, separate items, but as parts of a whole. The technical definition of integration is making a whole out of parts. Making a single whole out of a number of parts. Now, this is the central process of human cognition. The one central process. This is what cognition is. So there's no question why I'm including it. This is even a preconceptual process. If you know, we start with disintegrated sensations, and we have to integrate them, unite them into the awareness of entities. But that's done automatically by the brain, so that's not concern of education. But what we're talking about is the integration from percepts to concepts. A concept, and here I'm counting on your knowledge of Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, a concept is an integration of concretes into a single new mental unit. For example, the concept man subsumes and integrates into one mental unit all the individual men there are, present, past, future. We observe some of these, a handful of them. We see that they're similar in certain ways as against dogs and cats and so on. We segregate them out mentally. We omit the measurements that distinguish one man from another. We unite them by one symbol, and the result is we have a mental unit standing in our minds thereafter for all men. And it's like a super integration. And thereafter we can think of all men in that one unit. And that's what enables us to induce. We observe some trait about a few men because this is true of all men. Ayn Rand describes this point by saying, or if she didn't say I said this, she told it to me in conversation, I can't remember. Concepts are space savers, mental space savers. And here the point is the Crow epistemology. Is anybody who does not know what we mean by that? Okay, briefly, it's the idea that consciousness is finite. You can only hold so much before your mind in any given frame. If I give you too much, you simply break down. So the essence of the human method of knowing the whole universe, the conceptual method, is to economize the units, reduce the number of units, enable us to hold a vast amount of information in just a few mental symbols. That's the essence of what conceptualization is. Down to the simplest example that you cannot even retain that. It's too much. It just blows your mind. But if I say this, you can retain it. This is 12 units and it's beyond the ability. You just tune out. It just becomes a blur. For people on the tape, I'm just pointing to 12 marks. But now I'm pointing to the word 12, and that is 1 unit, and you are thereby able to take it in one shot. That's integration. Putting units together into a super unit. And that is the essence of human cognition. The Greeks had a phrase for it, which was the one in the many. The one in the many. That was their way of talking about integration. If you know Thales, the father of philosophy, he said, all things are water. Now, he was applying to metaphysics what should be applied to epistemology. So, he's not necessarily right that everything in the universe is made of one substance. But as a symbol of the proper pattern, This was the correct attitude, and this is why he is the father of all science and philosophy. Because he looked at the tremendous array of everything and he said, what is it in common? What is the one element uniting all the many instances that we observe? Now, what philosopher was it actually that transposed this one in the many quest from matter to epistemology, and therefore is really the father of proper thinking? And I don't mean Aristotle either. No, even before Plato. Socrates. Socrates is really the one who first grasped that the essence of thought is integration, the one in the many, and he did it in the form of trying to find definitions. He would give 10 examples of justice, and he'd say, what is it that they all have in common? What is justice? That was an attempt at integration, putting all those instances into one definition. And that process has continued from Thales and Socrates on to Einstein and thereafter. Einstein trying to find laws so universal that everything in the physical world is subsumed under them. Now that's a general dissertation on the role of integration in cognition. What does it mean as far as education is concerned? The number one thing in your mind, once you've motivated, is you should always look for, detect, point out, and stress common denominators, connections, unifying abstractions, general principles. It's different ways of saying the same main point. Don't let your material sprawl into dissociated facts. Keep tying it together. Keep taking an overview. Keep pointing out, this is what binds it together. This is the one. Forget the many now. This is the one that ties the many together. In other words, keep reducing the units. That is the essence of the conceptual method that the child needs to learn. You have to gradually, by example, bring him to the point where he is mentally uncomfortable with a mass of unrelated data, where he has automatized the need to unify whatever he deals with mentally. And that is a feat of years to achieve that state, where that becomes an actual need. Now, you may think that this is pretty obvious, but it actually is radical advice. It is the exact opposite of the intellectual fashion today. The form that today's anti-thinking or anti-conceptualization takes is precisely to repudiate the one and to insist on the many. To give you an obvious, immediate political example, take the terrorist eruptions. Now, the standard view today, whether the New York Times or otherwise, is, well, there's so many different kinds of terrorists. For so many different kinds of reasons, it's a complicated world. There are no easy answers. We have to deal with each piecemeal. There's the IRA and the Shiites and the PLO and the Turkish assassins of the Pope, or no, Bulgarian, etc., etc. And they say there are so many different causes. There's poverty and religious fanaticism and nationalism and the impersonality of our big universities and so on and so on. Therefore, what can we do? We have to deal with each concrete according to the pragmatic decision of the moment. As against what would be the proper approach? Is there perhaps a connection between some of these things? Is there some explanation for the wave of terrorist eruptions at home and abroad? Is there some relationship among these groups? Might there possibly be a communist presence behind them? Is it an accident that they're all violently anti-capitalist? Is it an accident that they erupted on a world scale only after decades of the West preaching collectivism, racism, statism? Only after the West for decades repeatedly demonstrated that it was only a paper tiger and would appease anything. Would these eruptions be possible in a different world, where individualism obtained and the United States asserted itself? Now, if you ask these questions, you'll be very quickly led to a single unifying explanation, a one in the many. But of course, this will be denounced today as, well, if there are newspaper people, they'll say you're oversimplifying, and if they're professors, they will say you are monist. That's the vicious thing to be. Oneist. You're trying to find one. You can't do that. That is what you must do with your students on everything. Not invent connections, of course, if none exist, but try to find the common denominators on whatever level, and I stress whatever level. It does not have to be a profound philosophic principle. They won't even understand profound philosophic principles unless they get it on very trivial material at the outset. For instance, if you're teaching reading, and you come across two words you're teaching that both seem funny, and one is spelled C-O-M-B, and one is T-O-M-B, comb and tomb, I would consider it poor teaching if you did not point out what? When you came to tomb after comb, what? The same thing that you saw before. You see a common denominator here, a silent B. Now that doesn't seem to you like a very big thing, but that is a little connection in the child's mind. He just gets on a tiny example the idea that this example of reading is connected to some preceding. And then when you get to the word knowledge, what should you point out? A silent K. Now that's just like the silent B, but it's a different letter, so you're one level of abstraction up. You're making even a broader integration. And then you could go into, if you want, a little explanation of how words were formed and why some letters are silent and why some aren't. And the kid has got something out of this. He's noted a small, not a very important, but a small feature of language, and he's somewhere. Now this has got to be the method and principle wherever and whatever you deal with. That's what thinking consists of, and that's really all. If one of his friends or some figure from history or whatever does something he admires or doesn't like, instead of first asking him why does he like or not like, the earlier question should be what? Or at least at the same time, what else is it like? Is it like something else he's seen or something else he's read? He should always be on the quest to make connections. Now, in the Fountainhead, this is illustrated by reference to Rourke in what passage? This approach, for instance, to people. In the very beginning, the principle behind the dean. Now, that was his mental process. The dean did something. He's looking right away for the principle. He didn't know it, but it's like other things that he's seen other people do, so he made at least a provisional connection, and it took him, of course, the course of the book to figure out what was the connection fully. But he didn't just look at the dean and say, that's the dean. You know. You have to try to prod the student into eliciting common denominators where he would never think of doing it. For instance, suppose you were teaching the child Othello, or a young teenager, let us say, and he had also, let us say, read The Fountainhead, for the heck of it, just as an example. Now, one is a Renaissance work, and one is modern. There are tremendous differences in philosophy and in style, and one is a novel and one is a play, and so and so and so. But I would never do that if they were able to read it at all without saying, do you see any two characters, one in each, that have the basic same psychology? I would never do it. If you wasted that opportunity, it would be a pedagogical crime, because juicy issues of integration should never be passed by. Connect, for instance, from The Fountainhead with Othello. Now, I'm not going to take more than 12 seconds on this, so if you don't get the one I have in mind. Iago and Tui would be perfect examples to connect. They both have a hatred of the good for being the good as their essential motivation, but in radically different ways, different ideas of the good, and so and so. But that common denominator they have, unmotivated, unvenal desire to destroy the efficacious. And then, of course, once you explain that in a properly simplified way for a child, you ask him, throw in a few things about modern art. He begins to see that this little thing can open up a whole cultural key, and someday he very easily grasps what modern nihilism is. That's an example of integration. Now, the trouble with today's world intellectually is that difference is in and similarity is out. In other words, everybody stresses this is not the same as that. This terrorist group is not that one. Look at all the differences. And this character is not that one. But thinking requires you to find what's the same. Now, I don't say that you should say everything is the same and there are no differences. But you must focus on similarity. That is what's critical on every level that you can. Now, if you want bad examples here, which I don't want to take the time to go into at length, I refer you to my talk on why Johnny can't think. The look-say method of teaching reading is the exact reverse of the proper method because it's disintegrated concretes, whereas phonics is the method of teaching a few principles and then the kid can read everything. Or the way history is taught today, I also mentioned in that talk, the idea that there's 10 causes of the Civil War that have no relation to each other, that is the bad, the so-called pluralist, the anti-thinking method as against finding the fundamental principle. Your goal, as far as this topic is concerned, should be every subject should be one whole, W-H. And here you can take as your motto a very pregnant principle of Hegel, believe it or not. The true is the whole. Or to put it another way, every subject should aspire to become, as far as possible, like geometry, where you couldn't alter one theorem without wiping out the whole system. That is the model to aim for, so the student sees everything is so interconnected and so interrelated that it's one systematic total. Now, for instance, history is certainly not literally like geometry. It's not a series of deductive theorems. But even though men do have free will, history does have an inner logic. It does follow certain laws, and all of the events are interconnected. For instance, you could not have had Weimar Germany just as it was in all respects except the dominant art was man and reason glorified. And that would have been an impossible contradiction. Or just as it was, except that it had a constitution like the United States. Now, if you were teaching history and you were teaching that period, if I say so myself, you'd have to present it in a simplified way on the order of the way I did in the ominous parallel, so you could see how it all hangs together and forms part of one era with certain basic motivating premises which integrate all the developments. I'd like to take a minute to tell you just biographically, this is the method by which I was taught philosophy by Ayn Rand. How all of it, all of objectivism in this case, is part of one total. And that is why I feel a sense of futility at people who tell me, I agree completely with Ayn Rand, except, of course, for egoism. Or except for capitalism or atheism or whatever. That just simply wipes it all out. Actually, the way I was trained, my teachers would take two topics at random from objectivism, completely at random, and assign as the topic to figure out the connections between them. And we even sometimes had to do it in verse. Because I remember a topic on absolutism, and one of the lines from the verse was, man needs his reason in every season. There was a game, in effect. But it was a game in integration. I remember one assignment was to connect the census, the validity of the census, to private roads. The Y road should be private. And it wasn't really hard to do. The census are a requirement for reason to be valid. And that is a requirement for the individual to be self-sufficient. And that is a requirement to justify that there should be no compulsion on him by the government. And that implies they shouldn't force types of transportation on him. But, you know, it's easy to spiel that off now, but when you're just learning, that seems like a big... But that is the method of learning a whole, integrating it into one total, so that it stands in your mind that you could not alter one aspect without blowing it up completely. And that is what thinking consists of in any subject, whether it's history, philosophy, you name it. Now, I want to make a short aside here within the topic of integration on memory. You'll see why in a moment. Memory. Memory has a bad press in the United States. Nowhere else in the world, to my knowledge, but it does in the United States. Memory is equated with blind retention, Prussian rote absorption, a general failure to understand. You say, people use the word memory as a pejorative. They say he's memorizing instead of understanding. Now, I think that's unfair, but I want to say just this much. If you are against memory, as so many Americans are, the only way to reduce the need of memory is by integration. The more you understand principles, the less sheer memory is required, because the principle will give you the means to understand, figure out, and recreate the answers as opposed to just blindly memorizing. And this is obvious, for instance, if you are driving a car, if you have a general knowledge of geography, the more you have the general situation that you're aware of, the less you have to memorize concrete instructions. And the more you have no idea of the terrain or the structure of the roads, no principles at all, the more you have to say to yourself, turn right when you see a red post, and then go for 3 chickens and turn left, and you just, etc. And this is obvious why, for instance, the look-say method requires perpetual memory, but the principled method, phonics, requires very little. But the moral of this is not that memory, therefore, per se is unnecessary or bad or only for unprincipled people. Memory is necessary in many ways in any proper education. And it does not necessarily mean blind retention. Now, the reason for this is certain data must precede your connecting of them. You must first get some facts before you can relate them. So there's no use saying, well, just connect everything by principles. Principles connect something, and you've got to have the something. That's why particularly in the early years, there's a large amount of material you just must take in. For instance, if you're learning a language, there's no way of learning the vocabulary by principles. There's a lot of ways principles can aid you, can narrow the problem. If you're learning Latin, you can recognize certain words by their similarity to English derivatives, but there is an irreducible core you simply have to memorize. The same is true for dates in history. Now, if you know some history, some principles, in many cases you can recreate the approximate dates. If you can't remember Galileo's birthday, but you know something about history and the development of science, you know that he wasn't contemporary with Aristotle or Einstein. If you're in physics, you can explain why there's 9 planets. But first you have to learn that there were 9 planets. And there's no way you can infer that unless you're Hegel. Now, this is the value of mnemonic schemes. Now, we use those all the time growing up. For instance, on the 9 planets, it was simply a rule we learned, M, then, Jason, P. M, then, Jason, P. Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and you never forget it. That's a mnemonic scheme. It was not really hard. It took maybe 30 seconds. It was not the onerous thing that progressive educators say you must never saddle a child with this horrifying memory and so on. You have to learn the multiplication table and the elements in chemistry, etc. Memory is a capacity, a skill that needs training and development, and therefore there is absolutely nothing wrong with special exercises in it. When we went to school, recitation of memorized material was a standard part of the curriculum. We had to learn long passages from Shakespeare or Milton and then recite them before the class from memory. We were graded on how accurate our memories were. Now, with very few exceptions, Americans are aghast when they hear this. But I regarded that then and regard it now as an enjoyable and valuable exercise. There are countless ways in which a good memory is valuable to you even as a thinking adult. To try to remember the points a book makes, or the points Reagan made in a press conference, or the traits you don't like in a person that you just met, or the things you're going to buy at a grocery store. There's many, many ways, even as the most principled adult alive, that you have to retain concrete. And memory is your method of doing it. So you cannot rule out memory and say we're going to figure everything out. Now, before we leave integration, I want to stress one topic, and that is to find the one in the many is great, but that is not by itself enough. If you always, in teaching, move from the many to the one, from concretes to abstractions, from instances to principles, what pretty soon is going to happen to you? You're going to end up with only being as such before the eyes of your class. You're going to have only one broad abstraction, and that's it. You will end up completely Platonist with floating abstractions. So, a second or complementary direction must be constantly kept alive. The reverse direction. Not from concretes to abstractions, but from abstractions to concretes. From the one to the many. In other words, you draw the abstraction, you draw the principle, you get the kid to integrate, and then the next time or the time after that you see him, you start with the abstraction and you ask him what? Concretize. Can you connect it to reality? Can you give me an example of it? To make sure that he still knows what it stands for and what it applies to. Education is a shuttle. A shuttle. You go from concretes to abstractions and then turn around and come back to new concretes. And you must always do the one and then correct it with the other. So, for instance, if we were, educating in this course rather than just philosophizing about educating, I would come back another period and say, integration. Well, what an example of it be? Can you concretize? And if all you could give me back was the examples I gave you, that's no good. That means you don't have it. You have just a word. You don't have it as an actual integration of concrete. You've got to bring a child to the point where he is, in a sense, always dissatisfied. In other words, whenever his mind is dealing with concrete, he feels the urge to abstract and unite it into some kind of integration or principles. And whenever he's dealing with abstract principles, he feels the urge to reduce, break it up, apply it to concretes. Now, this kind of shuttling back and forth, which I think is unique to the objective approach to education, is dispensed with by the other two. Why is it dispensed with by the intrinsic school? Intrinsic school is the rationalist, the floating abstraction school. So they are disdainful generally of examples or concretes. On the other hand, the subjectivist or pragmatist is the empiricist type, and they are only interested in concretes and they derogate. That's the New York Times type. There's nothing in common and so on. Only the objective approach enables you to unite concretes and abstractions. And this is really, I think, the essence of what clarity is. Now, everybody recognizes, I strike that, most people recognize that it is desirable to be clear in presenting material. But what is clarity? What is clarity in conceptual material? I think it really means this point. It means concretes united by a concept, and a concept which is seen to be a union of concretes. So I would say the two gravest breaches of clarity are, on the one hand, a set of unrelated instances given to a class. Because that leads simply to mental breakdown. The crow turn-off. I can't hold it. I just don't get it. Too much pressure on the capacity of consciousness. And the other main breach of clarity is a floating abstraction, untied to reality, it doesn't know what to do. These are the two things that leave the mind helpless, and I think those are the two things that really people complain of when they say it's unclear, I don't know what he's talking about. Now there's other things that you utter gibberish in general. Your sentence structure is hopeless, you're much too fast, but within the ordinary norms of being clear, those are the two crucial things to aim for. The third of my three principles: motivation, integration, and 1/3. You want to take a guess, just for the heck of it, at what the last one is? Hierarchical is one part of it, but the last word is the word I wanted, which is structure. Structure. Just to indicate in one sentence what I mean here. Suppose you agree so far. I'm going to motivate a class, and then I'm going to present concretes and draw the abstraction, or instances leading to a principle, parts to be united into a whole. Still, you have before you the question of order. Which abstraction or principle should come first, and why? Which should come next, and why? What concepts or principles should be presented in what order? And absolutely essential to thinking is not only what you do in the content of your thinking, which is integrate, but the order in which you do it. And that is the topic of structure. So if I wanted to summarize the whole 3 points in one sentence, I would say like this: thinking consists of integrating data for a specific purpose in a specific sequence. Integrating data, that's the second point. For a specific purpose, that's the first point. And now in a specific sequence or structure. Any process of thinking or teaching has to proceed step by step. It should be like a good movie or a good novel. It's got to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has to start with something that the students can grasp by itself. Something that doesn't require, in their minds, still another explanation. Something that is self-intelligible to these particular students. And that is the equivalent of an axiom in cognition. A starting point, a primary, a beginning. And then you, as the presenter, have to build on this. Follow it step by step, and culminate in some final point, conclusion, or ending. Many people go wrong by not grasping the role of structure. There are countless points that can be completely clear if presented in the right sequence, with the right background and the necessary preparation, but which are unintelligible if given out of sequence, even though you give exactly the same point with the same illustrations, the same arguments. Therefore, it's not only what you teach to your students, but when. In other words, at what exact point, before what or after what, that is critical. And that is the topic of structure. Now, this is one important reason why the interest of the students is not the ruling standard in preparing material or in determining a class. Do you see why it follows from that? Why you cannot simply poll a class, find out what their urgent, burning interest of the day or the moment or the year is, and say, well, after all, we want to motivate a class, therefore let's gear whatever we present to their interest, such as it is. Do you see why it follows from what I'm saying that you cannot automatically appeal to interest of the students in determining your class? They may be interested in some question, very interested, for which they are not, in fact, intellectually ready. Maybe because they overheard their parents discussing something, or their peers, or saw it on TV, or whichever, and yet they have no intellectual framework to be able to learn this particular material. This is particularly true of many current events. They have no framework to understand or interpret the material. And this is the great, great besetting flaw of progressive education. With the idea that, well, just find something that the kids are excited about, something that stirs them, something from the headlines that's, quote, relevant, and then just gear the material to that, assuming even that they had any material to gear. Interest does not mean readiness to learn. You do want the students to be interested, but many times you have to create the interest by a deliberate motivation. You can't just take what's there. This, by the way, goes equally for the teacher's interests. They are no more the standard than the student's interest. Just because you as a teacher or parent are passionate about a given point, it does not mean that that point therefore should come first to your child or student, or that it should be the base of a whole course, or even that it should be included at all. Well, if interest is not per se the determinant of structure, what is? The hierarchical nature of the subject is the determinant of structure, the essential determinant. And let me elaborate on this point briefly. You know, presumably from your study of philosophy, that human knowledge varies according to its distance from the perceptual level. We start with the directly given, what we see, hear, taste, touch, smell. And that is the self-evident, the obvious, the simple, the unambiguous. You need no preparation for that. Once you've reached the stage that you can perceive at all, you can perceive in any order, and you get it whole from the act of looking. Then we build on this, and our knowledge gradually becomes more abstract, more complex, more general. And we have to rise in a very definite sequence. Each new stage rests on and is made possible by the preceding. And you know, we use the analogy of a skyscraper where each story is built on the story beneath it. To put the point another way, knowledge is not a grab bag of unrelated items. It has a definite set of relations from the foundations of direct perception on up to the most esoteric, complicated, and advanced theories. And proper education has to reveal, or rather retravel, that structure with the student. It has to take him up the levels from the foundation, from the directly perceptual, letting him see at each point how one level proceeds from the earlier back to the directly given. That is the only way to tie advanced or abstract knowledge and concepts back to reality. You do not do it directly. You cannot just introduce a complex theory and then give a few examples and think, well, I'm tying it to reality. It's not floating. It is floating until and unless it has been connected by a series of intermediate levels all the way back to the directly perceptual. Now, a very simple, obvious example. If you are teaching a child such a concept as furniture, you don't do it by saying, furniture is this, this, and this, because he cannot get it even though you are pointing to instances. Furniture, I take here as a simple example of a higher level concept. And a higher level concept is one that you cannot get directly from perception, but only from earlier concepts. So in this case, you would have to start by teaching him table and chair and bed and so on. Only after he grasped that much firmly could you say, now we're going to go in effect to another step. We're going to go to graduate school, relatively speaking, and have one term that encompasses all these different things. But he could never do it until he had first conceptualized the first level. What he would probably get us, if you tried to do it directly, is a woozy feeling that some kind of big objects are furniture, but he wouldn't have any distinction between furniture and doors and automobiles. It would just be a stew in his mind, and he might learn to ape you, but it would never be actually tied to reality, because the only way to tie it is through the next step down. Now, math is another obvious case, the teaching of mathematics. Arithmetic has to precede algebra and calculus. Otherwise, you simply make nonsense out of the entire subject. Now, the moderns do exactly that. The attempt to teach addition and subtraction, the most elementary arithmetical operations in terms of set theory, is the most incredible corruption epistemologically, because it's trying to teach the elementary by the advanced. It's trying to take something, even giving them the benefit of the doubt and assuming that set theory had validity. You're trying to teach the directly obvious by means of some fancy, incredible, abstract theory. And that makes absolute hash of the subject in the child's mind. And if you want to ever sometimes see what's going on in math, I found this a very interesting book called Why Johnny Can't Add. We all steal that original title, Why Johnny Can't Read, Why He Can't Add, Why He Can't Think, because it was such a great title. But this is full of material on what they are doing in the teaching of math that would not only make your hair stand on end, it would make it actually fall off. And one of their crucial corruptions in the modern attempt is to collapse the hierarchical nature, to take the incredibly abstruse and complicated as the foundation and derive the self-evident from it. And the result is you can't do a better thing to explode and destroy the child's mind. Now here's an example. For instance, the moderns criticize traditional geometry as it's not rigorous enough. And for rigorous, they mean they want, in effect, axioms that are unintelligible, from which they can then deduce the standard axioms, and that's supposed to be really rigorous. They don't say it that openly, but that's what it amounts to. This is what they give to youngsters. I mean, this is pre-10 years old. I'm giving you one example only of an axiom from geometry, which is dictated in this form. Now, you know, the old axioms of Euclid are very straightforward, you know. One parallel line through a point to another parallel line. If equals are added to equals, the results will be equal, and so on. Those are very straightforward. This is a modern axiom that's given to youngsters. If the points of a line are divided into two sets, such that all the points of one set precede in the order of the points on a line all those of the second set, then there is one and only one point which separates the points of the two sets. Now, you try and imagine studying geometry, which you don't know anything about it at this point, and the teacher says, that's where we start. I mean, if people end up after one class, let alone after a year, of an incredible phobia against math, they cannot add, the thing is impossible, it's gobbledygook and gibberish, this is the reason why. Now, that statement, if you pore over it with an adult knowledge, is true, that one I just read. And it is self-evident. It seems to me, in my ignorance of mathematics, to be utterly useless. But in any event, whether it's true or false, it is a crime to take a youngster innocent of geometry and say that's where you begin. That is a violation of the hierarchical structure of knowledge so gross that thereafter you make the child uneducable in arithmetic. Now that, of course, is a distinctively modern aberration. Mathematics did not used to be taught that way. In fact, in mathematics, the hierarchical structure is pretty obvious. It's probably the simplest subject to figure out what order to follow in. So if we could only go back structurally, at least, to the tradition, as far as I know, that would be fine. But my general point with regard to structure here is it is not applicable only to concept formation or to mathematics. Every subject, every topic, every lecture has some kind of hierarchy, some kind of inner logic that is inherent in the nature of the material. And an educator or a presenter or a communicator must follow this structure. That's the only way to keep the student and the material anchored in reality. Now, if you think about it, you will see that following this kind of structure is really what thinking logically consists of. This is not a different point from being logical. This is teaching logic in practice. I do not think you teach logic by giving a child 3 or 10 or 40 fallacies to watch out for. Although that's helpful if you can think of some decent fallacies that you should watch out for. Nor do I believe that you teach logic by having a whole bunch of formalized rules, whether Aristotelian or a la Bertrand Russell or any other, of symbolic deduction. which I don't think is even helpful in thinking clearly anyway. Logic in its philosophic essence consists of asking and answering why about any statement. What is the reason for this? What proves this conclusion? And another way of saying that is, well, what does it come from? What does it rest on? What precedes it in the order of cognition? Logic, therefore, to think logically is really an issue of order. One idea or fact being the basis of the next. Now, if you think of the standard Socrates syllogism, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, that's the arch example of logic. Because the premises precede and lead to the conclusion. Whereas if I said Socrates is mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore all men are mortal, it's the same three units, but the order is no longer of logical structure or hierarchy, and the consequence is completely confusing and unintelligible. Therefore, if you're interested in logic and teaching the child what that consists of, you have to repeatedly exhibit the right structure in your material. That's the central way, in my opinion, to give a child the grasp of logic. Now, this is a real challenge to any teacher or presenter, because the order is not always or even dominantly easy to figure out. And the reason for that is this. As it stands in your mind, if you already know a subject, a given subject is a complex whole, WH, whole, a total, a body of information that you have already automatized in your mind as something that you just know. And this is true whether you're talking about a play or a historical era or a philosophic system or whatever. Whether you're an expert in Cyrano de Bergerac or Platonism or Weimar Germany or whatever it is, the whole is in your mind at one time and it's one unified total if you have followed step 2 and integrated the material. So it's not immediately apparent to you, well, where do you begin to present this? Because every point, if you properly integrated it in your mind, right away suggests every other point, and the whole thing is present to you as one unified total. What you as a teacher or communicator, and this point is wider, of course, than just teaching, have to do is break the whole up into its parts. You have to figure out how to take something which is simultaneous in your mind, namely all the elements of this whole, and make it into a sequence, one after the other, so that at the end it will be one total in the student's mind also. So if I wanted to give a definition of teaching or communicating in general from this one perspective, I like the following. See what you think of this one. Teaching is the transfer of a cognitive whole from one mind to another by means of transforming it for a while into a temporal succession. I like that, I must say. Should I repeat that? Teaching is the transfer of a cognitive whole from one mind to another by transforming it for a while into a temporal succession. All right, teaching is the transfer of a cognitive whole from one mind to another by means of transforming it for a while into a temporal succession. In your mind, it's a completely integrated whole. At the end, in the student's mind, if it's properly taught and you point out the integrations, it's one whole. But you can't get it directly from your mind to his except by saying this point, and then this point, and then this point. So you have to make it a succession of parts across time. Now, to me personally, this is by far the most challenging and enjoyable part of all teaching or communication. That's what made me go into teaching. I personally, if I can be forgiven this brief excursion into biography, really from the time I was very young, got a big charge out of the experience of having this whole and then trying to break it up into parts and figure, well, where would you start, and where would you go next, and how would you organize it in order to make somebody else grasp it. And I find that you learn a tremendous amount from this. It is not simply a matter of how do you let some ignorant person grasp what you already know inside out, because you have to learn a tremendous amount about the subject to figure out what is the proper order. You have to continuously ask yourself, what depends on what? What did I have to know this point? What is its logical foundation? Is such and such a point really a fundamental, or is it a derivative which depends on something else? And I think this is one of the central reasons why teachers so often say that the first beneficiary of teaching a subject is the teacher himself. He learns more from his presentation than any student can, because he has to do this process of analyzing it in a kind of detail that the students don't. Now, I'm going to take a few minutes to give you one or two schematic examples of how this would actually occur in practice. And I'm going to take our present mini course on the philosophy of education, because you already have the material at hand, so to speak. So we'll go into the question of determining a structure. Now, I never presented this course before, so I had to go about getting an order of material. Now, you might say, well, look up some standard text on the philosophy of education and follow their order. But you wouldn't say that if you read the text. So we're assuming that it hasn't already been worked out by somebody, that you have to come up with an order on your own. Well, my method of getting a structure for material is like this. First of all, I list in no order at all as many key aspects as occur to me. I have a whole in my mind but no structure. So I just spew out on paper, absolutely randomly, anything that strikes me that I feel somewhere or other has to be included. I try to get the main parts down somehow. Now, that's the first step. Now, for instance, in this course, in preparing this course, let's say that I started in this order, and this is approximately correct. I thought to myself, well, the first thing that occurred to me was you have to teach thinking methods. How you teach thinking methods, that was the first thing that struck me. And then I remember the letters I get about do we need teachers' colleges? Are they important? So I said, you got to put in something about training teachers. So that was another element. Then I paused and I said, gee, I can't offhand think of something else. My mind raced. I said, gee whiz, I forgot all about the purpose of education. That's got to go somewhere in there. Now, I don't yet know at this point. Is this going to be the climax, the end? You know, I'm going to build the whole thing up and end with this is the purpose as a kind of surprise, or what? But somewhere or other, that's got to be there. And then I searched my mind, and I thought, I haven't even said what you should be teaching, so I got to do something on a proper curriculum. Now, let's suppose we just restrict it to those four. There were more, but that was the idea. You keep going, obviously, until the material stops coming. If no material comes at all, then you presumably are not well enough familiar with the subject to organize lectures on it. So you should do more reading and so on. If 50 topics come right away, you should also quit, because that means you do not have a purpose in your mind. You're just saying anything that you can think of without any purpose at all, and no one can organize 50 units. Because of what? Because of the crow. So you want ideally to get something between 4, 6, 8, units to work with. Otherwise, you're lost. And then when you've got, let's suppose I have just this much, you say to yourself, in effect, can I see a logic to starting with 1? Is there some order of dependence here? And the only way I can do that is just jump in. If I really don't know a structure, just jump in and point to 1 and say, well, could I start with that? Now, for instance, suppose I said, well, curriculum. I'm interested in that. What subject you should teach. Maybe that would be a good, easy one to start with. then I would ask myself right away, can you start with curriculum? And you would see immediately you could. Why not? Because you have to give some reason as to why this curriculum rather than that. And what kind of reason could it even in theory be? Well, you're right. I heard it over there. What is the curriculum for? If the purpose of the curriculum is to teach driver training, I mean, if that's what education is all for, then you've got to have one course on braking a car and one on steering a car and one on oiling and so on and so. But we've got to know what the curriculum is designed for. So obviously, we have to, the purpose of education has to precede the curriculum. Could I start with teacher training? Obviously, the question would be, teaching them what, for what reason? So obviously, everywhere we start, and this is the indication that you're on the right track. If everywhere you start, you keep coming back to, but I have to know the purpose. Before I can do that, that's a terrific place to start. Once you have a start, that's one good thing, because you're going to build on your start, see? So one way, you got to get a start. Then the next thing I usually do is go right to the end. I don't yet know about the middle, but I go right to the end and I say, can I single out one that has to come at the end, that presupposes everything else? Because my goal here is to reduce the number of units to work with. Ideally, I would want to segregate one half that has to be at the beginning and one half at the end, and then I've used up the material. But at least I get one at the beginning and one at the end out of 4. That leaves me only 2, which is a more dealable with situation. Is there one of these that presupposes all of the rest? That would have to come at the end? Training teachers. Why? We have to know, training them in what? Well, they're going to do certain methods on certain material. Which methods and which material? So that obviously is presupposed. Now, that leaves us in effect with a beginning and an end, and we got left in the middle. Thinking methods and curriculum. Now, in this case, I believe there is an option there. Often in the middle, there's an option. Certain things you must start with, certain things you must end with, and others you could argue, and it's a function maybe of your audience, your time, and so on. Now, that just is a mini. I'll give you one more detailed example in a moment. But I just want to, at this point, answer one question. You might ask me, can you always start with the logical starting point? Does the logical starting point always coincide with what your particular audience needs? And the answer is no, not necessarily. It depends on your audience. For instance, this course I started with the purpose of education. Could I start with that if I was giving this course in a regular college? Never. Never would start with that, even though it's a logical beginning to a course on the philosophy of education. Why not? Because, well, you tell me why I couldn't start with that. They don't know what philosophy is. They don't know what concepts are. They think education is a complete waste of time. They think the whole thing is just nonsense. And therefore, if you come in and say, well, we're going to start logically with the purpose of education, they look at you as though you came from Mars. And it wouldn't make any difference how clear you are and how interesting. It's completely beyond them because, in this case, the logical starting point is itself way down the hierarchy or way up. It's an application of epistemology, of philosophy, to a specific field. And if they don't have the foundation, the application simply passes them by. So you'd have to have a couple of weeks to try to get them into philosophy, into epistemology, to underscore the role of concepts, to break down their skepticism about all ideas are hot air and who needs it and it's a waste of time. And only after you prepared the soil, which you'd have to do in a frantic way to try to cram years of proper education as a background, only then could you start on the philosophy of education. Now, that's why it's a breeze for this audience, because you already had the whole foundation, so you just rattle off a motivation and then you jump right into the logical starting point. But that's only because you were properly educated in the right structure before. The general point is you start with material that is understandable on its own terms to your student. students. And here the point is every audience has a, what do we call it, with a theme, a context, right? They are neither utter ignoramuses. That's true, because if they were utter ignoramuses, that would mean they would be like newborn babies. So they come with something. Nor, on the other hand, are they omniscient. Otherwise, they wouldn't need teaching. You, therefore, have to select the starting point in your structure, not according to what you know, but according to what they do. You have to, in effect, put yourself in their mind while still being in your own. You start with what they need, while remembering that the goal is to get them past where they are into the new material that you have. In other words, you have to know the cognitive context of your audience. What do they come to your class with, and what do they not have that they have to have? What ideas are going to govern their listening to what you say, their interpretation of it? What widespread errors might confuse them or inhibit them or prevent them from grasping what you're saying? And on the other hand, what points are so obvious that it will bore them if you start making a fuss about them? Now, if I came into this audience and said, well, I can't go to the philosophy of education until we discuss the role of philosophy, and then I gave a laborious rehash of philosophy, who needs it, and quotes and so on, and you'd say, well, what the hell? I traveled across the country, I paid all this money. Who needs all of this? Now, I want to give you one more instance of this mini outline session, taking the second of our 4 units, which was teaching thinking methods. How to get a structure for that. Now, I want to tell you again the actual method I used, because I think it just helped to clarify this issue. We have teaching thinking methods. And this is exactly, because I copied it from my original notes, what I wrote down when I first sat down to plan this unit that we're now just finishing. You know, the unit that I said there are 3 principles: motivation, integration, and structure. This is exactly what occurred to me in this order. And this is how I worded it. And I think this is instructive, because I think this is typical of any process of organizing. The first thing I thought of was you got to motivate the class, because that's so obvious to me the place you begin. Then I thought, well, after all, knowledge is conceptual, so it's very important to conceptualize the material, derive principles from it. Then I thought, well, you got to be logical, so we have to make a point of stressing logic. Then I thought, oh, I have to make the point to them of the audience has a definite context, and if you don't start there, you know, it won't be anywhere. Then I stopped for a while, so I couldn't think of anything else. Then I thought, well, there's something about the hierarchical nature of knowledge that's important to determine, you know, if certain things have to follow from other things. Then I paused for a while and I thought, well, it's very important that each subject not be completely self-contained, that if you're teaching like psychology and economics and literature and so on, you have to make broad integrations. So I actually had a thing of broad integrations between one subject matter and another. And then I thought to myself, was there any other points that I kind of paced around, dried up material? What else do I dislike of what's going on today? And then I thought, oh, well, you got to say something about the importance of establishing certainty to the audience. You've got to teach the kids what they know and that they really know it. And then I tried to think, well, what else is there? Gee, I never covered the role of competition in class. Somewhere or other that pertains to relating to each other. That's got to be in there somewhere. Oh, and I never covered the role of humor. Now, I knew as I wrote these that these two are somehow different from all of these, in as much as these aren't epistemological methods of acquiring knowledge, but somehow I felt they belong in there, so I put them in parentheses. Now, take that as a fair sample of the original list. Now, many people, let's suppose all those points are correct. I have there 3, 6, 9 points. many people would say, well, fine, you got the material, and the way to present it in order is just number it. Number 1, motivate. Number 2, conceptualize. Number 3, use logic. Number 4, use, and so on. And number 9, use humor. Now, this is hopeless. This is not an organization or a structure. This is a pre-conceptual, pre-structured grab bag of data. And this is normally exactly what happens when you have a whole that has all kinds of ramifications in your mind, but you have not yet figured out the structure of it. So you just spew out whatever comes to you. Major points come with minor points. Last points come first, and you just pour it all out until you have that feeling of evacuation mentally. In other words, you've emptied it out. That's it. There's no more rattling around in there. That has to be presented. Now, your next crucial step is reduce the number of units before you even get to structure. See, if you have only 4, you can start saying what should come first and what should come last. But when you've got 9, it's hopeless. It's too much to deal with. Therefore, on the Crow method, you must reduce the number of units. You must consolidate. You must see that some of these are different aspects of the same point till you get it down to a workable width number. In other words, you have to yourself employ step 2 of the 3 steps. You have to integrate somehow, establish connections. Now, in this case, what would be an obvious integration? One that I made, which right away reduced me. I started, just for the heck of it, because I didn't know where to start, with motivation. And I said, well, what can I connect to motivation that will reduce the number of units that I have? And right away I thought to myself, competition is not really a way of learning material, it's a way of motivating. And therefore, this is just a small concrete under that. And because once I got that idea, then I saw humor is exactly the same thing. Right away, I relieved the pressure on my mind, because now these 2 are just parentheses under this, and I now forget them. I have one structure, motivation, and I leave these aside until I get to preparing that, and then I bring them back, and I know already they're just a couple of small examples, and they go in at the end of that. So I've got it down now this much. Then I say, what else could I connect here? Now I stopped for a while until one thought occurred to me, which was, what is the difference between this and this? I said, what is a concept? A concept is really an integration of perceptions. It's perceptions put together into a superunit. And what do I mean by integration in this broad sense? Is just putting together even bigger units. So really, this is the same one principle, namely integration. Whether from percepts to concepts or from whole fields to other fields, it's the same one overall phenomenon. So I decide the common denominator is really integrate, of which this is a form, and this, and so on. So I've reduced that down to there. Now I look at the rest and say, well, the thing that clarified it most to me was hierarchy. I started on that. And I said, well, hierarchy is an issue of what depends on what. What comes first? What comes second? That's an issue really of order. Then I thought, well, order. What is logic? And I just indicated to you, logic is really an issue of order. And what is context? Context is where you have to start, what you can take for granted on the part of your audience. What is the beginning? That is an issue of order. And then I thought, well, what is certainty really? Certainty is what remains in the mind of the student if you give it to him in the right order. Because each point paves the way for the next, and it becomes unmissable, therefore. And therefore I decided there is really one thing uniting logic, context, hierarchy, and certainty as far as teaching thinking methods is concerned. There's really only one topic of which they are all different aspects, and that was the topic of structure. So I ended from 9 down to 3. Now I found it illuminating, although I knew all the 9 points to start with, simply to see that there were three broad issues to tie it all together. It became already more organized in my mind, rather than like a recipe book of, the 12 causes of history and the 9 methods of teaching reading and, etc. and so on. Generally speaking, as to how many points you should reduce it to, there is a certain option, but I would say if you have only 1 point, that's no good. Because 1 point was your original whole that you're trying to break up. If you have 12 points, that's no good because of the Crow epistemology. I like anything from 3 to 5 myself. 3 is nice. It's more than 1, and you can deal with it. And to me, this is one of the main reasons for Hegel's success. He picked 3 as the all-purpose number, and it's just the right number for human epistemology. You can hold it, it's within the Crow, and yet it's complex enough so it's not one whole that just sits there like a, Neoplatonic glob that stares you in the eye. It has its parts and so on. So 3 is just right. I love to go with 3 when you can. Now, you can't force it on the material. I've given classes where it has to be 5. But beyond 5, I will not go. I regard my material as defectively structured if I have to give more than 5, because then I don't think it's properly integrated. Now, of course, when you have the 3, say, you then have to say, well, where do you start and what order? And here it was fairly straightforward. If I'm teaching thinking methods, I thought, well, you have to say, what is thinking? What does it consist of? And of those 3, once it was down to those 3, it's integration. So that has to be the substance of the thing. But then I said, well, where does motivation go? Well, that prepares them to do it. So then it has to precede. And where does structure go? Well, that must be the form in which you present that. So I decided motivation, integration, structure. Now, this is just a schematic example, and I don't mean to bore you with the inner details of, working out a lecture. But I think, in essence, that is what a teacher or communicator has to do with his material. You have to pave it, break it down, consolidate, structure the points. Years later, your audience or your class will have forgotten entirely the order in which you presented it. But if you do it properly, they will retain the total, and someday your success will be, if anybody asks them, how do you teach thinking methods, they will blurt out in no order all those points again, because it will have become one whole in their mind, although only you will remember what the structure was that you presented it. Now, I believe this method has to be applied on every level of education, within a class, across a course, across a whole subject, across the entire curriculum. And it's particularly important in determining curriculum, which you're going to start on briefly, at least this morning. I hope. This principle of structure prohibits, for instance, class discussion in early grades of nuclear warfare. It simply prohibits it. Why is that? Students in the early grades have no first-hand knowledge either of the facts, the principles, or the value judgments necessary to judge the appropriateness or inappropriateness of nuclear weapons. They have no knowledge of science, of politics, of man, of philosophy. They are completely at sea. They have no basis to understand these issues, and consequently, if you inject controversial current events at them, that is simply blatant adult propaganda. If you ever look at the NEA, the National Education Association, teaching guides on how to introduce the issues of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy and so on to classes, you would be horrified at the brazenness of the anti-nuclear propaganda that is shamelessly offered as educational enrichment. And the reason for it is not only, that these people are zealous ideologues who are far left and want to promote their views. They are presenting something intrinsically out of sequence. It's like presenting calculus before arithmetic. The kids have no theoretical possibility of thinking about it. and therefore there is nothing that the presenter can do but simply jam his views down their throat. Now, a couple of points about structure that I still want to make briefly. It's not enough to have a logical structure. The students have to know what your structure is as you're presenting it. They have to know, in some terms, what your order is, where you are at any given point and why, where you're going. Now, in writing, it's sometimes considered a good principle to disguise your transitions, so the reader flows smoothly from one point to the next and is carried along on the momentum. But that is very different from speaking or teaching. In teaching, your transitions, your change of gears should be as blatant as possible. You should say, that's the end of point one. Now we're going to a different point. Now this point's got a beginning, and I'm going to introduce you to it. Now I'm finished the beginning, etc. Always have this little song and dance so the guy knows how to take notes, where you are, where you're going. And then the standard definition of a good lecture is it's got three parts. First you say what you're going to say, then you say it, then you say you said it. And that is really true. The other point I want to make about structure is that there are many times options, even within the proper hierarchy of the material. You may decide to give a principle first and then examples, or vice versa. In other words, the so-called inductive versus deductive approach. And that depends on how much time you have, how complicated the subject is, what your audience knows, etc. Or you might decide to give a cause and then its effect, or an effect and lead back to its cause. Or you may follow chronology, an obvious thing to do if you're teaching history. And in some contexts, there's no particular order. There's no reason why you have to do one thing rather than another. You have an option. So there are certain options with regard to order within the proper hierarchy. Now, the last point I want to make with regard to order is this issue of certainty. I just want to observe that this is a key aspect of teaching thinking methods. Your students have to find the conclusions convincing at each stage. They have to, if you have the right structure, they will see why. It will all be tied to reality. And at each point, they will experience a sense of confidence, sureness, certainty. And this, of course, is a virtue. Knowledge means certain knowledge. If you're communicating knowledge, you are communicating certainty. Even if you're only teaching at some point a probable theory or a possible theory, still the evidence that leads to that theory has to be knowledge, has to be something you know for certain, and the status of that theory is knowledge, something you know for certain. Now, I regard it as essential to teaching thinking, to give the audience and the students the conviction at each point that what they are getting is certain. Now, you know that this is in tremendous contrast to today's climate of skepticism, agnosticism, relativism. The more I learn, the less I know. Nobody can know anything. Everything is changing. I regard that whole thing as, besides being philosophically wrong, as being lethal to thought. Why think at all? If the more you learn, the less you know. I mean, you're digging your own grave. You may as well quit while you were ahead with blissful ignorance. There is no motivation to think if you can't acquire knowledge by it, and there is no method of thought. How can you think if there's no basis for any thinking, because everything is debated? Now, today's educational establishment has turned skepticism, the view that you can't have knowledge, into a religion, and they proselytize for this religion in class systematically across years in a way that makes an old-fashioned religious fundamentalist seem to be kind of fair-minded, impartial, and rational by contrast. We have zealots of skepticism today who openly say that their purpose is to inculcate confusion, ignorance, doubt. And one of the chief methods, to tie this to our present topic, by which They inculcate this new religion is to present conceptual material out of order, so that in fact there is no way for the students to decide what the conclusions are as in the nuclear situation. The kids, in fact, are helpless. They cannot judge or know, and so they immediately and inevitably come to the opinion, it's all a matter of opinion, nobody can know anything. If I had to name one recruiting method for skeptics, it would be teaching kids by the anti-hierarchical method. That recruits skeptics more than any other. Now, you would hardly believe, or maybe you would if you have the opinion of today's educators that I do, the lengths that people go to in order to inculcate uncertainty. I have to read you this much. This is an article, you know Hunter College in New York City? There's a museum of philosophy connected with Hunter College. And I'm going to read you from a neutral summary of what goes on in this. Just a brief excerpt because it's early in the morning and why do it to you. The tour of Hunter College's Museum of Philosophy in New York begins when a guide asks visitors to push a start button near the entrance. Stabbing at empty air, however, museum guests quickly discover that the button is nothing more than a reflection. Why did you try to push a button if it wasn't there, says tour guide Susanna Shefford, taunting her visitor. What if you tried to sit on your bed and it wasn't really there? How do you know you're really here? How can you prove to me you're not just dreaming? Sheffer, a Swarthmore College freshman, says the perceptual deception experienced by those who try to push the start button provides the basis for a philosophical discussion on the nature of reality, thereby starting them on their tour of the museum. And then there's more and more of this, and then I'll just read you this one quote. Our goal is to make visitors ignorant, says Mark Ast, vice president and co-founder of the museum. The conviction that you know a great deal seems to blind an individual. But when you realize how little you know, you're stimulated to search for knowledge. Now, these people exist. Now, of course, the exact reverse is true. The exact reverse of this theory. When you, quote, realize that after all the years you've learned nothing, or you get brainwashed into that idea, you simply give up. So if you want to do any one service for your audience, you have to, or your students, you have to take a stand and say, for the reasons I gave you, on the basis of the facts I outlined, this is the truth. Now that will send a frisson of terror through a modern audience, because you simply must not come out for something so horrendous. Now let us see, on this topic of structure and conclusion, once more the role of philosophy. Basic philosophy. And here I go back to the threefold viewpoints that we've been tracing throughout. If you are an intrinsicist, what will be your view on the topic of structure or order? Well, you can get even deeper than that. It's self-evident. Each point is self-evident. Consciousness does not have to go through any process to learn. It simply passively receives what amounts to revelations from reality. Why should you believe it? Something out there said so. You don't require any processing, any digesting, any understanding, any order. The teacher or God or the textbook or the encyclopedia said it, and that's it. And therefore, structure is simply not important to an intrinsicist. What about a subjectivist? Anything goes. Everything is based on feeling. No logical order is necessary. You do what you want. And then, of course, you find you have no confidence in your own feelings because they have no basis. So you end up looking to society's feelings or some authority's feelings. Both of these two schools, the intrinsicist and the subjectivist, end up in authoritarianism. They don't say, accept this because logic and reality require it, but accept this because an authority, whether it's society or God or whatever. And so you get this phenomenon. Now here is a last brief little quote on this topic. This is from, and I stress, a non-controversial newspaper column, a Tucson newspaper, addressed to students and I guess parents. It's an advice column, and to me this is just a little indication of the attitude on this question that pervades. I'll read you 2 paragraphs. The headline is, "Not always easy to tell." The truth, you see, what's the truth? And it starts with what's true, who knows, and so on and so on. But then it says, if you can't always tell the difference between true and false, don't worry. Lots of people before you had trouble too, sometimes even the smartest people. That's the general, background. Don't worry. But now we're going to get to the practical advice. Is there any sure way to tell if a thing is true or not? Not really. But if you're writing a report for school and you want to make sure you've gotten your facts straight, follow this rule of thumb. Now, can you guess what it is? No, it's not enough. Well, the one person might be wrong. Well, I'll just read you this sentence. This is the rule of thumb. If you read a statement in 3 different places, it's safe to use it. Like Hitler, Goebbels, and Marx. Now that is the last-ditch consequence of the intrinsic and the subjective schools. And this is why, if you are interested in individuality and independent judgment and combating authoritarianism, you have got to advocate objectivity, because only that will give the child reality as a basis for his judgment and wean him away from this conformity and authoritarianism. All right, that finishes the topic of thinking methods as far as we can cover it. All right, now questions now on today's material. Yes?
Do you think it would be a good example of motivation for a parent to pay a child for a good grade with money?
To what?
To give a child money for having achieved good grades.
Do I think it would be a proper motivation to give a child money for having achieved good grades? Certainly not as a primary. Because the primary motivation has got to be what I indicated, the ways in which it would develop his skills. Otherwise, the money per se would not motivate him to really think and learn the material, but just to go through the motions. It strikes me as a mixture of categories, but I could imagine a circumstance where it would be okay. I don't think as a general rule that I would think that would work very well, and I do think a parent should give a child money necessary for his needs anyway. So it's not too clear to me how much money and how you would work out a scale. I had never thought of that, to tell the truth, but it does not strike me as a terrific idea. But I wouldn't veto it in every conceivable instance. If a kid really wants something and he really understands the reason for a certain subject, but he needs a little bit to get him over, to do a little more work, and you tell him, if you get an A in history, then you can have, this Mercedes or whatever. Sometimes it's just the added little touch that helps. Yes, right.
The relative importance of focusing on similarities versus focusing on differences. Can you expand on that?
Well, the relative importance of focusing on similarities rather than differences. To some extent, my insistence on similarity is culturally conditioned, because we live in a culture, the dominant philosophy of which stresses only differences and is tremendously anti-conceptual. You see that everywhere. I gave examples of it in philosophy. It's of interest that the leading philosophic movement is called what? Analysis, linguistic or philosophic analysis. Analysis means breaking a whole up into parts, seeing the differences. Now, the complementary procedure is Synthesis, but of course that is never discussed. Synthesis is considered wicked today. System building is bad, and so on. Now, in that framework, you see, there's a tremendous propaganda against similarity, so to a sense I bend over backwards to stress its importance. Now, there were cultures that were different. Cultures which focused entirely on similarity and repudiated differences. And that is just as disastrous. Do you know what type of philosophy or culture would focus only on similarity and deprecate differences? I'll give you two examples from philosophy. Plotinus and Hegel are two examples of philosophies that derogate differences and stress the one, similarities. What kind of philosophy does it lead to? No. Utilitarianism is completely on the different side. Utilitarianism is a type of empiricism. Which? Now I'm thinking more fundamentally than ethics. But what is the name of that type of philosophy? Do you ever hear all is one? The difference between you and me and this and that is all irrelevant. We really are all one. One what? You just have to have a... Collectivism is the political manifestation. Mysticism or idealism is the term. The idea that the universe is one ineffable totality, what Plato called the form of the good, or what Plotinus called the one, or what Hegel called the absolute. And that everything is really just an aspect of this one, and that therefore the only cognitive process of value is to connect things and ignore differences until you finally get to the one, which is everything. And then you see that I am you and you are me, and we're both this watch, and this watch is the First World War, and everything is everything else. That's what the dialectic process is for. Hegel's 3 steps of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, which then becomes a thesis for a new antithesis, and so on. That whole process is to end you up at the one, where you see that all differences are nothing, except the difference between Hegel and the rest of the world. Now, in that kind of culture, it would be very important to stress differences, because that's crucial to grasping individuality, to grasping entities, as opposed to this one metaphysical soup. That is also equally crucial. In fact, you can't say one over the other. Analysis and synthesis, or the one and the many, or similarities and differences go hand in hand. But the reason I stress similarities today is that we live in a tremendously difference-oriented culture. And therefore, from this point of view, the crucial thing to stress is similarities. The other thing is this: differences are largely given by perception. So you don't have to, it doesn't take a lot of work to grasp that you are you are you are you. It just takes corruption to deny it. But similarities you have to work to pull out, especially if they're not, on immediate level. Is that enough?
You stress one or the other in order to achieve balance.
Correct. You want to put it that way, we want balance. Yeah. I'd like to just make a rule. People were baffled last time that I kept asking for new people. They wanted to know how did I distinguish a new from an old. By new, I mean merely if you could restrict yourself to one question per period, then other people during this period get a chance. I didn't mean you had to be an entirely new human being. Yes.
I mean, people on both counts. On your talk on motivation, you implied that motivation is a volitional act and that youngsters need to be motivated to learn. Yet, it seems to me the overwhelming evidence, at the risk of being an intrinsicist, is that they have an insatiable desire to learn, and that what most teachers and parents need to be advised about is how not to destroy that desire or demotivate them. And that seems to me what Montessori also...
Well, let me address that. You say you think that youngsters have an insatiable desire to learn, and that you think that it's just you have to be... the important thing in education is simply not to destroy that desire. I disagree with that. You're in very good company with that, though, because the opening line of Aristotle's Metaphysics, with which I also disagree, is that all men by nature desire to know. I think the refutation of that is to go into any classroom, certainly any college classroom. Now, let me finish. I know what you're going to say, because I've heard this many times. It is certainly true, this much is true, a being starting to learn to use his faculties gets a definite satisfaction out of using them. And if guided in the correct mode, will continuously enjoy, so it won't be a horrendous struggle. It is true that knowing will be natural in the sense that something he will want like he wants food. But it does not mean that it will be automatic. And natural does not mean automatic. Particularly when you have to learn things that you are not interested in at that stage, and yet you have to for reasons that we'll go into next time. There is very often the situation where the requirements of structure is at variance with the child's interest. That what he is interested in, it is inappropriate to present to him at that time because it doesn't have the structure to grasp it. In which case you then have to specifically provide the kind of motivation to carry him over this until his interest naturally flows in the same direction that the logic of the subject goes. So I am not an advocate of the view that find out what the child is interested in and just present it. Motivation is unnecessary. I definitely think it must be provided, not simply not interfered with. But I do agree that if it were properly provided, it wouldn't be as horrendously hard as, for instance, if today you go to a college and you have to motivate them to study philosophy, it's virtually hopeless. I mean, what you have to do to break through is incredible. Yes, in the back.
I see a danger in competition and grade when you deal with a young child. I'm talking about preschool and early grade school, when the child cannot differentiate yet between his mastering of a certain subject and his own personality.
And what?
And his own personality and efficacy. When he can see failure in a certain exam, or constant failure in beating or competing with his classmate as a proof that he is incapable. And
yes, I understand your question. That's a good point. Isn't there a danger of competition among students as involved that the child will not distinguish between his inability to grasp certain material and his general failure or inefficacy as a person? And shouldn't you therefore avoid competition? I agree that that danger exists, but I don't think this is the way to avoid it. That danger would exist no matter what. Even if there was no competition, if he gets his lessons wrong all the time, or any significant lesson, improperly presented, that can equally draw in a child the conclusion that he is inefficacious, inadequate, a failure as a person. So it's very important how these things are handled. Now, remember, if competition is presented as a life and death issue rather than a game, rather than just as, the gravy on the meat, if it's presented as the meat, and, it's a grim thing, and it's number 1 student is the hero, and number 5, is worthless, then, of course, it's completely out of scale. I'm speaking of it only as an adjunct, and with the understanding that this is just a little play on the side to get over the rougher spots. This is not the standard essential way of motivating the child. And it is very important for a teacher, whether you use competition or not. A teacher nevertheless must, in many, many circumstances, frustrate the student. By frustrate, I mean withhold from him praise or approval because he's not learned something, or he's learned it incorrectly, or he's made a mistake. You cannot take the attitude that in order to encourage self-esteem, which is desirable, you tell the kid, terrific, wonderful, whatever you do, that's fabulous. Because sometimes he messes up, he gets it wrong, and he has to find that out, both to learn the material and as preparation for life. But the way you do that is not by ever putting him to a test, whether competitive or otherwise, but by the fact that, first of all, you point out his flaws in a way that include recognition of what was good. What part did he get right? What lesson did he do well? What aspect did he grasp? So he sees he has the material to correct, and that it's not that, big an error on his part. You always let him, in that sense, you have to keep praising. This is something I learned both on the receiving end and then later on the giving end. At first, when you start to teach, you are very eager to correct the child completely, or the student. And if they hand in a paper, you rip it to shreds. This is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is awful. And you emphasize because you want the lesson to stick. And I discovered, to my surprise, that people were really, the kids were very often really shattered. And when I had no such intention, it literally never occurred to me that you should always prepare the ground for criticism by reminding them or saying something positive, and that really makes a big difference. But, so I agree with the thrust of your question, but not with the implication that any competitive thing in whatever context is necessarily going to be. It certainly wasn't when I was growing up. We did not take it that way. Yes?
Is it too soon for you to comment on specific trends in education today? I have in mind two particular figures in education today that I'd like you to comment on.
Who?
Okay, Glenn Doman, who's allegedly teaching babies to read with flashcards, and Marva Collins teaching in Chicago.
The first, what's the name? Glenn
Doman.
I don't know. Never heard of him. Never saw it. If anybody can teach a baby to read, I'm all for it. I would really be delighted if my daughter, who's now 2 months, could read. I think it's a little early. To me, there's no such thing as too early. I just can't figure out how to do it. But I would think it needs a little. I think she'd have to reach the perceptual stage first. The only thing I know about Mrs. Collins, or Miss Collins, is what I saw on a documentary, and she was terrific. And the thing that was good about her was that she had very high standards and did not compromise them. She demanded that the kids know literature and history and so on in a way that would horrify, these typical school administrators who give them just pap and junk and have no expectations, whatever. And she really held them to rigorous standards. That much I completely approve of, but I don't know enough of her specific standards to say that I necessarily agree with everything. But with that aspect, absolutely. Yes. Didn't you already ask 4 questions today?
No.
Oh. All right, yes.
That was last week. Do you have any tips or techniques on how to deal with the slow and the fast kids in a large classroom environment?
That's a really hard one. How to deal with the slow and the fast students alike in a large class. There's no ideal answer to that. You have to aim at the middle. And you have to put enough in for the 2 extremes without losing the other. In other words, if you lecture only to the very bright ones, and any teacher can pretty much tell right away that if you take in everything, they're just voracious. And if you take in nothing, and the rest sort of get it. Now, the way I try to do it is to watch a few of the brightest ones and feed them something every once in a while, like I ask a question, and then they will volunteer the answer, and then they're pleased that they got the answer, and that keeps them for a little while. At the same time, I sometimes ask somebody who's in the brighter side to re-explain a point that I know some of the other ones didn't get, so that the brighter one gets the satisfaction of speaking in public, and the dumber one gets a repetition that he needs. There are ways like that you can, try to restrict your office hours to the better students, and give them, some added reward of personal discussion. And if a lesser student is motivated and struggling, I'll do extra work for them too. But on the whole, you aim for, it's been said, you aim for the C+ student when you lecture. That gives the bright student a chance to goof off every once in a while, think about something else and still come back. And if the lesser ones really work, they can keep up with you. But there is no ideal solution. And it will stratify itself like that virtually. However, if you break it down to 10, there'll be 2 and 2 and 6. And if you break it down to 3, there'll be 1 and 1 and 1. So it's almost impossible unless you have private tutoring. and that is financially very prohibitive. Yes?
Would the same teaching principles apply not only for teaching general thinking methods for children, but also for teaching specific subjects to adults? And would there be other fundamental considerations?
Well, would these principles apply to teaching any subject, even for adults? In a general way, certainly it would be. An adult has to be motivated. Your teaching has still got to be connecting some kind of data by some kind of principles, and you still have to give it to them in some order. But when you're doing it for an adult, it's considerably simplified, assuming an adult who's already been educated in the primary sense, because he comes with a definite structure of interests, and if you're presenting him material in the right structure, the motivation should be pretty easy, because you just have to identify in a few conceptual statements, this is where it hooks onto your life. He already knows the material for how to integrate from his earlier education, so you can be much more specialized, and you don't have to nearly constantly integrate for him. You can focus right in on some very small technicalities, because he has the broad general picture from his earlier education. In that sense, it's much more technical, much more specialized, and much easier to teach adults than to teach youngsters, where you're laying the very foundation. As to specific tips, every subject has its own tips. Every subject, and then within that subject, every subdivision. If you're going to teach history, there's special ways to motivate, special ways to indicate the right structure, special kinds of integration that are crucial. And then how you apply that to German history or ancient history, etc. And so there's a lot to know within a subject that you're teaching. But the one who can figure that out is very simply the teacher who knows the field. If you know the field and you know certain general principles, it doesn't take much to figure out what to do to present it. I think we have a couple of minutes because we started a few minutes late. At the very back there.
What do you think of curves as a standard for grading?
Oh, why do I think of curves as a standard for grading? Absolutely wrong. Bad. Curves is the idea of comparative grading. Instead of giving a person an objective assessment of what percent of the material he knows, like you say 80% is a B, you know 4/5 of the material, you give him a relative assessment. You say, of this class of 50, you are dumber than 13. Now, what does he know? I mean, he doesn't know a thing from that, whether he knows 4/5 of the material or 1/10 of the material. Why do it at all then? Grading is completely useless for that grounds. I am an advocate of grading. I do not believe in the modern idea that all you should tell on the report is what percent of the child's potential he's using. For the reason that I do not think the teacher is clairvoyant. How are you supposed to know what percent of his potential he's using? Maybe he's not got much potential, it's 100%, but he's ignorant, he knows nothing. So you have got to have an objective standard of knowing, and there's no way except in some way to quiz the class, whether you do it orally or in writing or whatever. So I'm sorry to tell you that I'm an advocate of regurgitation. In other words, that after the lesson or after the year, at whatever appropriate period, in some form, you have to say to the class, what do you know? What is the answer to this question? Tell me what I said. Now, there is a way of finding out whether they got it and understand, or they're just blindly memorizing it. Any decent teacher with a couple of years' experience can read the first 2 sentences of the first essay on any essay exam and tell you whether that student knows the material of the semester. A minus, B plus, all the way down to F. And any accomplished teacher can do that. It is not true that it's impossible to tell and so on. There are borderline cases where you can't tell if he's a C plus or a C. So give him the benefit of the doubt and say C plus. But I strongly do believe you should grade. You should grade by means of essay questions from the very earliest years, and you should give numerical grades 58, 74, 96. I would venture to teach the most abstract philosophy and give an essay exam and give a grade on a scale from 1 to 100 that I would be prepared to defend. There is no other way even for the student to know how much he knows, let alone the teacher. It's very clarifying to a student to find out that he thought he had, knew the material, he only got 43. It comes as big news to us, to several students. And if that is administered early, it's an extremely valuable lesson. So, how did I get off onto this? Now, I have one written question before I take them from the floor. I said that questions on education I would segregate to the question periods on education, and there was one that came in for the general question period that is on education. I think the person wouldn't have asked it if he had heard what I said today, but he obviously hadn't heard it, so I just want to acknowledge it. This question, which is very long and which would have benefited, if I may say so, by being shorter, amounts to how do you educate a creative genius? But it's presented as a polemic against what I said. I'll try to excerpt it. I see a young Leonardo da Vinci, age 6 or 8, looking out the window at a class of birds in flight. And this goes on, he's concentrating, and all this is brewing in his mind and so on. The teacher comes up to him and raps his knuckles. I don't care if you are Leonardo da Vinci, turn around and do your multiplication tables. And then he goes on that I advocated a highly directive form of education, and wouldn't that in effect destroy the budding genius who needs to be left on his own? First of all, I do not believe that it would destroy a budding genius to acquire proficiency in conceptual ability. I've tried to indicate that that is a human faculty, and even geniuses are human. So the only validity I recognize in this is this much. If someone is oriented in a specifically visual or non-conceptual direction and has the talent that that should be the way his life goes, then certainly he shouldn't be spent all the time on a skill that is in his context relatively, not totally, but relatively peripheral. But still, I do not believe Leonardo could have been what he was if all he did is look at the birds. If he hadn't learned his multiplication table, he would never have been able to make the scientific discoveries and do the things on perspective and so on. So it's a false dichotomy that either he looks out the table as the spirit, out the window as the spirit moves him, or he has to learn this useless stuff. If the curriculum is properly chosen, it should benefit everyone. Moreover, the questioner has a paragraph to the effect, but aren't there a lot of options, and doesn't that require that each student follows his own rate? The answer is yes, there are a lot of options. No, that does not require that any student follow his own rate, because options simply gives the teacher possibilities. Options means you could acquire table before chair or chair before table. But that doesn't mean one student has to learn table first and one has to learn chair. If you provide the motivation and the context, you can follow any option and that will be suitable to everyone. You cannot infer, quote, each student must follow his own order, unquote, from the fact that there are options in cognition. That is a non-sequitur. Further, this individual says, if you were going to teach Leonardo, shouldn't you, quote, gently tell him the value of what you're teaching rather than, quote, force him to do so? Now, I think it's a misrepresentation to say I would force this. I tried to stress that you must motivate, and motivate has to be voluntary. I do think, however, that when you come right down to it, and with all the qualifications, nobody can educate a creative genius. You can give them certain preliminaries, certain preconditions. If we had a recipe to make a creative genius, it wouldn't be a creative genius anymore. It would be like a robot, like a computer. We'd just put in the data and he would do the skills. If I knew how to find the cure for cancer, I could get up here and say, these are the methods by which to find the cure for cancer. Go and do it, and with enough specificity so it wasn't just think. I would know the cure and there would be no creativity required. You cannot teach creativity. And therefore, it's wrong for the schools even to try. The most they can do is say, there's something special about this kid, let's give him his head up to a point. But there's also a big problem. How do you know whether the guy looking out the window at 6 is Leonardo or goofing off? That's all I'm going to say on that question. Yes? Well, is it appropriate to ask about proper testing methods? Sure, but I've said really what I had to say about testing methods in the preceding question period. I believe in testing. I believe in written testing, essay-type examinations. I believe that students should be asked either to give back the essence of the material in writing and see whether they really got it, or if they are asked for their own views, they should be told the question in advance. I don't think it's fair to make students think on exams. Thinking takes time and can't be pressured. So what I used to do is divide exams into 2 types of questions. Those which are regurgitation. You know, what in essence did I say? Like if I was giving a test on this, explain in the 3 essential methods of whatever, or teaching thinking, you know, or what is the purpose of education and what theories of education do I reject, etc. The factual material, that they simply have to give back. But suppose I had left some things for them to decide, I would tell them in advance, here's a sheet of 5 possible questions. One of them is going to be on the exam. What is your judgment of such and such? What is your judgment of so and so? And because if you're asking them seriously to have an opinion, you can't just spring it on them. I don't think you should do that. That's basically the way I handle it. But I believe in written exams from the beginning. Now, I do want to make one disclaimer or one qualification here. Several teachers came up and said that I was inculcating guilt in teachers because it's impossible to give written as opposed to machine-graded multiple choice by the size of the class. And I certainly understand this, so I have to say, if you are in a situation where you're given huge numbers of students and it's just impossible to give essays, you have to sacrifice the students because it just can't be done. So you have to accept reality, and you should not feel guilt. And I'm prepared to confess publicly I have done that. I taught at a place in New Jersey for 1 year in which I was given a class of 160 to give the exam on Thursday afternoon from 4 to 6, and they wanted the grades back Friday morning at 10. Now, I mean, you just can't do it. And so I made up this absurd multiple choice exam on philosophy, which had the most ludicrous questions. I mean, I just went out of my mind. I had questions like, cogito ergo sum means that the sum of all cogitations is to be measured in ergs. True or false? And I found, interestingly enough, there was absolutely no correlation between the midterm grades and the final grades. As the midterm were essay, and the final had no relationship to it at all. The good students on one did poorly on the other. It was hopeless, but I had no choice whatever. So if you have to, don't feel guilty about it. But properly speaking, you should give essay exams, and there is a certain conflict here. Essays are much harder and more time-consuming to grade, but you do your students incalculably greater service if you do it that way. Yes? No, what is an autodidact, and was Ayn Rand one? Well, yes and no, but an autodidact, strictly speaking, is somebody who educates themselves and does not have a formal education. And the term is usually applied to people who take only a few years of grade school and thereafter go out to work, like at 8 or 10 or whatever. Now, I know some people, but it's very rare, who have, learned the rudiments at school, reading and writing, and then went out on their own, held jobs, and systematically began to read and educate in certain key fields. And they really have, you would never know they didn't have a good college education. They've learned a tremendous amount, but it takes extraordinary discipline because they don't know what order to do it in, They have nobody guiding them. They have to be exceptionally intelligent and motivated. They have tremendous struggles that the ordinary student doesn't have. They're just going through the jungle of the totality of knowledge. So it's a rare person that can do it. Now, Ayn Rand was certainly not that. She had a complete high school education and she had a complete college education. She got her baccalaureate degree from the University of Petrograd. She studied under an authority on Plato. She learned philosophy from a very distinguished teacher with whom she didn't agree, but nevertheless, Losky, he was a very famous, extremely erudite Platonist, so she had excellent teaching. I would certainly put the teaching she got even under the communists, because they were still using the old teachers to some extent, under the czars, way ahead of what you'd get under the teaching in this country. I mean, there's no comparison. First of all, Europe has better teaching than the United States does, and then on top of that, the teaching in, when she was going to school in that decade, I mean, we've been getting worse every decade, so you figure the 80s against the teens and 20s, she had comparably a fantastic education. So she is certainly not an autodidact. Now, you don't use the term autodidact for learning on your own, obviously. She was a creator and she learned on her own. But it's a more specific concept than that. Yes?
With regard to how much, I should say, with conveying certainty to the students on your material.
Right.
In light of the spiral progression of knowledge, can you speculate on just how much certainty or what threshold of certainty a student should feel during a lecture?
How much certainty should a student feel in as much as he doesn't know everything and he'll be even more certain later? I wouldn't put it that he's going to be more certain later. I would put it that certainty is contextual, and that at any stage of knowledge, if you properly delimit the context, he can be certain of what he knows at that point, even though later he will see many more ramifications, many more factors that contribute to it. It's not that he will be more certain later, he will be certain of more later, which is a different proposition. So I would say certainty is like pregnancy. It does not come in degrees. Probability comes in degrees. Certainty, you have it or you don't. I can't ask my own wife, can I? All right, yes.
Is it good to show kids the evening news regarding their context is not developed? You can't just turn on...
Is it good to show kids the evening news since their context is not developed, that you can't just turn it off? Well, you and I will have to argue about this privately, but my own viewpoint is you cannot prevent them from watching the news, nor is it even desirable to. But kids are very smart, and they make a distinction between what they are learning at school and what they watch on TV. They can see something on TV, they can hear an adult conversation, and it does not go that deep. It's not like their task. Their task is what they get from their teachers or their organized lessons. So it doesn't hurt them because they're not seriously addressing the material. And from that point of view, sure, I would let them listen to the news, or, I would even tell them my opinion, but I would do it briefly in the form of, this is what I think, but I don't really care to go into it right now because it's a complicated subject. I don't think the thing that I think harms them is not watching the news on TV, but watching TV as such. That is, without being very delimited in the time. And what we're going to have to discuss is how many hours a week we allow this, but I think we agree on that point. Very few hours. Because otherwise, I won't mention names, but I know youngsters who are, practically speaking, as destroyed by gazing at TV for 10 hours a day as if they were taking cocaine. They are in another dimension. MTV is all they can perceive, that music TV, and they just stumble out of bed and watch it till they go to sleep. That is destruction. And I think it's the responsibility of a parent, if necessary by smashing the TV set and locking the kid in the closet, to prevent that. Yes?
You had mentioned that 3 to 5 is a good division of a whole. And
well, I was sort of being a little jocular, but I do think that. Yeah.
And had said that 12 is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And yet the philosophy of objectivism a 12 lecture?
Well, that's a very good point, because I was unclear on that point. Let me correct it. I said I should be 3 to 5 units, and I gave a 12-lecture course, and aren't I refuting myself? Well, we were talking on different levels there. I am saying, within the material that you want them to grasp at any one time, this doesn't mean that everything has to be 3 units, otherwise it could only be 3 subjects and only 1 point about each. But it does mean this. If you're lecturing, you give, say, 3 units. By the time you get to the second and third lecture, you've got to have reduced the whole first lecture to 1 so they can hold it while they're doing the second lecture. And by the time you get to the 12th lecture, the whole thing has to be reduced still to 3 or 4 units. Now that's where, for instance, I find it extremely handy that there are 5 branches of philosophy. See? Because by the time I get to the end, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics are 3 units, and that covers the first 9 lectures, you see. So, and of course, on the other hand, each one of these points, like integration, etc., is itself broken up into 7 sub-points. So you are always breaking up a whole into many parts, and then combining those parts into bigger and bigger wholes. At any given operative unit, though, whether it's that hour or that course, you must in some form get it within a manageable number. I hope that clarifies. That's a very helpful question. Yes? What do I think of the Montessori method? I'd like to defer that to the next lecture for a reason that will be clear the next time, but I do promise to answer that the next time. Yes?
You mentioned that there were certain options in the order in which you gave a topic, and you had given a couple of examples of what options were, like chronology or going from cause and effect or the other way around.
Right.
What's the general principle involved in saying this is optional versus not optional?
What is the principle involved in saying that something is or isn't optional? The only one thing can be, is a certain order logically necessary or not? Is something required to get to the next point? Is this unavoidable to know to get to the next point? The best single case where no special order is required, and this will illustrate to you the extreme of what optionality is when all of your material is on exactly the same level and there is no actual development from one point to the next. For instance, you're giving 6 examples of the same point. Now, sometimes examples have to be structured, because you start with the simple example to illustrate the principle and then you go on. But assuming a context in which the theory is already clear, and you want simply to give 6 examples, there is no necessary order of those examples. And it can be very clarifying to find this out. I remember learning this when I was writing the Ominous Parallels, and I got to the chapter on Weimar culture, the culture of hatred. And I had, one of these lists, and I had on it modern theater and modern music and modern painting and Heisenberg and physics and Gödel and math, and I had about, 10 or 12 examples, and I thought, I'll follow my standard method of trying to see where must you start and where must you end, and for the life of me, I couldn't do it. I couldn't find anything that had to precede anything. Any one of them I could have started with or ended with. I was absolutely baffled, and I figured, well, I still had a tendency to rationalism in those days, and I thought, there has to be some, axiom and development, some structure here. I simply couldn't find it. And I remember talking about it to Miss Rand, and she said to me, but it's all just examples of the same thing, so it doesn't make any difference what order you use. You're not using theater to explain education or physics to explain music. You're using all of them to illustrate nihilism, which you've already explained in principle. So it doesn't make any difference what order. And she gave me a very helpful piece of advice. She said, in a situation like this, the determinant of structure should not be logic, but drama. What will be most exciting? What will be most colorful? What will most intrigue the audience? So you build and build and build, and then smash them with the most extreme at the end, which is what I tried to do by leaving for the end Dadaism. I figured once you did that, you know, you enter this art exhibit through a urinal and so on. You're not going to get worse than that. So I made that as my emotional end, you see what I mean, of the survey. But there was no logical necessity to this, and I found this generally very helpful, her point, that where the content is on the same level and no logic dictates it, then use drama as a even there are options, and this brings in the point also of your own emotional relation to the material. Because once logic says you have an option, then you should give the most emphasis and development to what really matters to you emotionally, since it is an option. This is why it's very hard, if you're a rationalist, completely to organize the material, because some options depend upon what you personally care about, what is important to you. Now, I say if you just do that, you're a subjectivist. But if you do it within the framework of the requirements of logic and reality, your own emotions about the material, if you're a knowledgeable person, is an important guiding point. I hesitate to say that, but it happens to be true, so I have to say it. We have, I believe, one more question from some new person, as we have defined new. Okay, right in the front.
In light of the value of testing for the student, where the student has to organize their thoughts, write essays, and regurgitate the material at a minimum, wouldn't it be nice to have, I'd love to have that in this organization.
Why don't we give written exams in the Thomas Jefferson School? Since they are a valuable part of the student's learning experience. The only answer I can give is the faculty and the resources and the time is simply too limited. If we gave you the exams opening day, even suppose that we had the faculty degraded, we wouldn't have the time to go over it with you. Can you imagine I have 300 exams? And you know, if they're to benefit from an exam, it's not enough just to say okay at the end. We're going to cover that next time. What you are obligated to do with any written material you get from a student, you have to really give it a going over. And that would simply be prohibitive. We need small classes. Now, I don't know, I'll turn it over to Dr. Reisman. He may have plans to, maybe for $20 million a student, to give you personal exams. I'll give it to you.